you wouldn't deal with that issue by going to the sun. You would deal with that issue by going to the incredible amount of force that holds together atoms. So the whole phenomenon of nuclear power. Historically, that's really just beginning as a way of harnessing energy. And the quantities of energy you're dealing with you could arguably outlast the sun, ultimately. Just through, the amount of energy that's holding stuff together, given a certain rate of use, would outlast the sun. So there's nothing special about the sun. And the way this works economically, because it's kind of complex scientifically, but economically it's really simple. At any given time, when we buy like a gallon of gasoline, all we're saying is, at this point in time, this is the best, cheapest way of doing things. It's not a commitment that we're going to do it in 100 years or 1,000 years, any more than me having an iPhone now is a commitment that I'm going to use that in 10 years. So the way capitalism works, it's not sustainable. Sustainable isn't that great. Sustainable just means you can repeat something over and over. Capitalism is better than sustainable. It's progressive. You're constantly figuring out new and better ways of doing things before you've exhausted the old way of doing things. And so putting it in terms of entropy is just kind of a cute way of people getting around that and getting around their moral premise that somehow we should sacrifice for hundreds or thousands or billions of years in the future. So put it right on the table. If it's between me and someone 10,000 years from now, I'll take myself. And I'm glad someone 100 years ago was thinking about himself and technologies that could benefit his life, because that's what caused him to develop the technologies that benefited me. I'm glad he didn't just leave the oil in the ground and says, well, there's going to be a guy named Alex someday, and I want to cut a penny off of his gasoline price. So I think the whole way we think about the future is wrong. But if we understand that capitalism is progressive and that resources are created by the mind, it's a really different and I think more empowering perspective. Yes?
Could you discuss geothermal?
Any particular aspect of it?
Financially, should we have it?
Okay, I'll take both of those. Should we have it? I have a pet peeve about that, in the sense that I just want to make clear, like, what I see my job in the world as is not the person who knows what type of energy people should use, but the type who knows enough to know that I can't know, and that we should leave people free to figure it out and decide. So I can tell you a little bit about the history of it, but I can never tell you, like, oh, this will never work, or unless it's something really crude. But like with solar and wind, I would never say, oh, this would never work in any. All I can say is it's radically inferior. What they're calling for is a suicide pact. The reason why is because they have a suicidal philosophy. That's it. Geothermal, I mean, it's an interesting technology. So what you're basically dealing with is you're dealing with the fact that the best way we know to get energy is from heat. It's called heat engines. Almost every major form of energy that we get comes from you're burning something or getting heat, you're turning around a turbine, you're either moving some wheels or generating electricity. And so beneath the surface of the earth, you learn in school, right, it gets hotter and hotter and hotter as you go down. So geothermal is taking advantage of that at certain fairly low levels, and you're drilling down and you're trying to take advantage of the heat. The problem economically has been, I mean, there's some places where it seems more effective, like maybe Iceland. So it could be that often these things are things that work some places and not others, which is one reason not to be universal about it. And I have nothing against it at all. I mean, it's pretty cool. It's just a lot, and you're drilling really deep. You're dealing in salt water a lot, which is incredibly corrosive, so they have all kinds of longevity issues with the technologies that we're using. And generally it's not economic. And if it ever became economic, keep in mind you're drilling tens of thousands of feet below the surface. The green movement would have a field day because they're against, drilling deeply in the earth and changing nature in that way. So, yeah.
So my friends in the green movement plot the average global temperature, say in the 1800s up through today, and it shows a warming trend, and then they extrapolate. But so what are your arguments that they're not correct, that does not continue, and that perhaps it's a more cyclical warming, cooling cycle? I mean, what is the thinking of it?
Well, let me tell you what I think about sort of how I think we should frame the question. So the question, and this is a point I made in a different way, but it's good to make it. When we think about environment, we need to think about how does our environment affect us? really be clear that we're talking about in primarily human terms. If someone wants to place some other species above humans, they should be explicit about that. Because one thing I've seen with the whole climate debate is that there is no interest by the green movement in what is the actual history of the livability of the climate in the past 100 years. So over the past 100 years, we've had a 1 degree increase in temperature. I believe a substantial amount of that is related to human CO2 emissions. What has happened to, how has that actually affected human beings in terms of the climate we live in? Well, if you look at the most important statistic in the US, climate-related deaths, they've gone down by 99%. And the reason is because the key, within certain boundaries, the key to a livable climate is not exactly what the climate or the temperature is or where it happens to be in its history or even whether it's impacted by man or not. It's do we have the technology to make the climate livable? Because if we don't, then we're going to suffer and die in any climate. There's very few, there's no climate really in which everyone in the world can just thrive. There's no global mean temperature anomaly that's perfect. So one thing is that the whole way of looking at this issue needs to have a human focus and needs to incorporate the whole issue of human technology and how human technology is the key, I see your hand, I'll get to you in a second, is the key to a livable climate. And when people just say, human beings are changing the climate, therefore we need to take these drastic steps, that shows they have this premise that it's somehow wrong for human to change them. The question should be, is the byproduct of these life-giving fossil fuels, is the CO2 byproduct creating a catastrophic danger? And if it is, then that should be dealt with scientifically and technologically, which is the exact opposite of the way it's being dealt with by the Greens, namely sort of religiously opposing nuclear power and hydro. So it's not like, I have nothing to say, I have no sort of inherent philosophy that says human beings can't change the climate. It's just a question of, we have to look at what is the evidence, and we always have to remember that there's a human standard. And we have to remember, if we're talking about getting rid of fossil fuels, we're talking about getting rid of the foundation of modern life, so we better be really, really appreciative. And I think the fact that none of that is incorporated into the debate is evidence that it's really the modern movement about catastrophic global warming is primarily a political movement. It's not primarily a scientific movement. There's interesting scientific research being done. So I'll just give one, what I think is the most revealing example, which is this idea that, this idea of consensus. That there's this consensus that, first of all, I don't know why people think consensus is so great since it's almost always wrong. But there's this consensus, and if you go to our website, capitalism.com, one of the fellows I work with, he's a physicist, and we talk about this at length. But if you look at, say, the American Physical Society. So the American Physical Society is probably the most prestigious scientific body in the United States of America. Well, I don't think it should be, but it probably is at the moment. So if anyone would give an objective statement on this, they would. So this is physicists. This statement would not pass a freshman logic class, because what it says, and you can listen to the podcast or read it for the exact wording, but what it says is it starts out with, scientists all agree that man has contributed something to global warming, or most agree, and then it jumps to, therefore we must take drastic action to mitigate catastrophe. But they jump from some indeterminate amount of warming to catastrophe to must be changed. But A, you can't jump to catastrophe, and B, even if there was a catastrophe, a bunch of physicists would have no idea how to deal with it. They don't know anything about economics. They don't know about, on what timetable or anything like that. So what's going on is it's clearly not that the physicists are, and also these people, the vast majority, have no specific knowledge of how the climate as a whole works. So what's going on here is that this is a clear intimidation. This whole idea of a consensus is a clear intimidation exercise. If you actually wanted to know the situation, you would say, look, we've got this issue. What do we know about CO2 and the climate? And one thing to bring up would be, what are our predictive abilities about the climate? The answer is they're really, really bad. Why? Because the climate is an incredibly complex system. Does that mean we should give up and not study it? Of course not, we should. But we have to be honest. A real scientific movement is honest about what it knows and what it doesn't know. This is a complete lie. I mean, it's completely dishonest about the models. And then they deliberately misrepresent the scientific mechanisms and the certainty of those. So they talk about the greenhouse effect, which is a known scientific phenomenon which creates a certain amount of warming. But the thing they say about the greenhouse effect is that the greenhouse effect is going to lead to a skyrocketing in temperature. But the way the greenhouse effect actually works is it's a logarithmic effect. So the more CO2 you have, the more gentle its effect on the climate is. The whole idea that it's going to go like this is based on what are called positive feedback loops, which are posited but in no way demonstrated, and certainly no provable way demonstrated, and it's distorted. But so there's nothing wrong with positing feedback loops per se, but to intimidate people and say, oh, you don't believe in global warming, you don't believe in catastrophic global warming, you don't believe in the greenhouse effect, that's been proven by science. The whole thing is just an intimidation exercise, and it's being run by, the people really in charge of it are people who are morally righteous, who think that capitalism is wrong, and throughout the history of capitalism, they've always had an excuse for why they hated capitalism. Marx hated capitalism because it would keep us all poor. Then it made us all rich, right? So now then they said,